For hundreds of years, humanity had enjoyed a golden age. As a result of the Mars-Earth Civil War, our genetically modified descendants were able to colonize entire star systems, all while maintaining complete peace for many generations. Of course, after the Q invaded, nothing remained the same, including humanity. The seemingly godlike race of invaders tweaked and reformed our species into animal-like creatures, building blocks, pets, and grotesque abominations. By the end of their 40-million-year reign, the dwindling remnants of humanity were unrecognizable. Formed and fitted to new alien environments, these post-humans were left to adapt or die. But despite all odds, many of humanity's twisted descendants managed to survive, even thrive in these new worlds. Species like the colonials managed to transcend their useless forms to become a fully functioning and mobile society. The contorted and dim-witted lopsiders regained sentience and developed interplanetary travel. But while the lineages of some posthumans achieved great things, others were sadly cut short, whether by natural disasters or simple lack of resources. In any case, as any reader of All Tomorrows knows, time was not kind to races like the Blind Folk, Titans, Bone Crushers, and Temptors. But what if those races hadn't gone extinct? What if they, like many other posthumans, had been given the chance to become something greater? This is the question posed by artist Vanga VanGog, who envisions a different future for these unfortunate beings. Though the reason for these differing accounts isn't fully known, it seems most likely that these newly uncovered events take place in an entirely alternate timeline. In any case, for at least 6 species, things played out much differently here. Come along, dear traveler, as we explore the revised future of all other tomorrows. When the Q invaded, a large faction of humanity tried to escape by tunneling underground. Sadly, this effort was in vain, as the Q easily found them and, like they'd done with the rest of humanity, genetically transformed them. The blind folk became nearly perfectly adapted for their new subterranean home, complete with large mobile ears, long fingers, and the ability to echolocate. As a result, they completely lost not only the ability to see, but their eyes altogether. Previously, it was thought that shifting tectonic plates wiped out all of the blind folk well before they could achieve sapience. But data from this alternate timeline indicates that a small group of blind folk escaped their doomed home and managed to survive on the surface. But of course, the blind folk still lacked eyes, so they adapted to stalking their planet's moonless nights. Over time, their ears moved to what had been their ancestors' eye sockets and merged with the ultrasonic call-producing structures derived from their noses, forming a grotesque lotus of flesh. At this point, these descendants of the blind folk were called clickers. The clickers' sonar proved so precise that they could literally see forms and even textures in the reflected sounds. These astounding adaptations catapulted the species to the status of apex predator. They even managed to regain the sapience once lost to their kind. Eventually, enormous cities began to pop up across the planet's surface, though at night these cities were nearly invisible. For an eyeless species, after all, no lights were necessary. The spaces of the clicker cities were cramped by our standards. In fact, to us, their dwelling places resembled something like the Kowloon walled city, albeit much cleaner and integrated with greater technology. Indeed, for the previously cave-dwelling clickers, these dense cities were the perfect homes. But though clicker society and technology advanced greatly, their inability to see meant that the sky above was nothing more than an endless void. Needless to say, this terrified the clickers. Fortunately, when visitors from this void arrived, they were friendly, even helpful. But that's a story for another time. For now, dear traveler, we'll be moving on to another no longer doomed species. The Titans were a monolithic race of subhumans genetically manipulated into giant elephant-like herbivores. The Titans roamed the open plains of their home planet for eons, and their prehensile lower lip allowed them to interact with their environment with great dexterity. Advantages like this facilitated the Titans' reacquired sapience, though by our own terminology, Titan society never moved beyond the Stone Age. It was previously thought that the entire species was wiped out by a catastrophic ice age, but in our alternate timeline, data reveals that a small subset of Titans had developed a thick coat of fur and were therefore able to survive the ice age, though this survival came at the cost of their proto-civilization. Eventually, the ice retreated and the sea began to rise. This split the Titan species into 2 separate lineages, one population becoming isolated on an island with limited resources, and as a result, greatly reducing in size. This population became a distinct species called the grazers. After some time, a land bridge arose and the now vastly different Titans and grazers were forced to compete. At first glance, given their smaller size and lifespans, it may seem like the grazers were at a severe disadvantage. But while this may be true, as it turned out, what nature took in terms of physical attributes, it gave back in intelligence. The woolly titans, on the other hand, were so large that they were never in any danger of predation, and therefore never needed the same level of cunning ingenuity. As a result, sapients never re-emerged in the titan populations. A million years later, the grazers had surpassed the Stone Age level of intelligence possessed by their pre-Ice Age ancestors. They built an expansionist civilization that displaced their giant barbaric cousins and eventually drove them to extinction. The grazers themselves were roughly the size of a cow and with much more gracile proportions. The lip trunk of their ancestors split into two dexterous appendages, much like hands, which facilitated the use of tools and allowed them to build vast cities. But though some of their adaptations could be seen as similar to our own, the grazers' society is certainly not. In a true herd fashion, relatively few dominant males owned the majority of the race's females, with most other men having to either become their pen lovers or gain favor with a harem owner and receive permission to spend a night with one of his wives. Pictured here is one of this race's most beautiful women posing on a beach. With most attractive females locked in harems, the demand for erotic photography like this is extremely high among the common male grazer population. In the post-human reality brought on by the Q, the story of the mantelopes is undoubtedly one of the most tragic. Bred by the Q as singers and memory retainers, the mantelopes didn't fare well after their overlord's abrupt departure. Their bodies quickly reverted to a quadrupedal stance, utterly useless for any kind of meaningful interaction with their world. Their minds, however, remained fully intelligent. The mantelopes lived in an agonizing limbo of unrealized potential, their societies doomed to never progress beyond their body's limited ability. The one and only point of comfort for the mantelopes is that their plight was short-lived. In the original timeline, without a way to put their minds to use, the species lost their intelligence after a few dozen short generations. The fate of the same species in an alternate timeline, however, is much, much different, though it begins with another post-human race, the Spacers. A marginal group of spacers dared to explore one of the Q's abandoned star systems, where they came across a species that seemed to retain some semblance of sentience. Of course, these were the mantelopes. The spacers realized that the mantelopes were not only intelligent, but their breeding had left them with an innate desire to fill their minds with as much information as possible. Of course, thanks to the cruel hand dealt to them by fate, they could only marginally quench this desire by the retelling of oral traditions. Though some details had grown fuzzy over the generations, the spacers quickly realized that the mantelope's ability to retain information was unparalleled throughout the galaxy, and much of that information was directly related to the Q. Purely out of practical benefit, the spacers began to trade with the mantelopes, offering them protection and comfort in exchange for intel about the Q and their machines. The spacers became this planet's gods, residing in the heavens and patronizing their chosen peoples via remote-controlled robot guards, and in return collecting a tribute of detailed accounts of this world's past. The information gathered by the spacers allowed them to fill in great swaths of missing information about the Q, and allowed them to reverse engineer many useful artifacts. Eventually, though, the well of ancient mantelope knowledge started to run dry. But the spacers quickly found a new role for the race, and it was just what the mantelopes had been bred for: the recording and retaining of information. What started as a simple trading agreement gradually became a tight symbiosis. Sprawling cities appeared on the mantelope's home planet, where millions of this formerly tragic species worked as regenerating, bug-proof computers, recording and storing every contract or scientific article that their orbital partners deemed important. In return, the spacers' machines provided for their every need. Eventually, the mantelope's nearest star system became the prime information hub and the unofficial capital of the Spacer Empire, and communities of mantelopes spread all across the galaxy aboard their masters' asteroid arcs. After eons of such close cohabitation, the species fully adapted to their role in the symbiosis. Their brains expanded drastically, in some breeds taking up more than 2/3 of the body weight. Their bodies, no longer necessary in a wholly artificial environment, became completely immobile. Large sections of Spacer's interstellar asteroid arcs were converted into sprawling networks of honeycomb-like nests, housing mantelope breeds with even larger brains modified for the zero-G environment and catered to by their former gods themselves. Finally, the whole race was connected to a telepathic network via neural technology, becoming essentially a biological supercomputer capable of performing calculations at rates previously thought impossible, storing exabytes of information, and even simulating matrix-like dream worlds for the spacers, now called asteromorphs, to interface with. These biological thinking machines, no longer resembling man nor antelope, came to be known as processors, and with their symbiotes they grew to dominate the galaxy. But while the immense storage power of the mantelope's brains was impressive even to the spacers, they will never know how much data was lost in the retelling of their stories from generation to generation. If only they'd had access to today's sponsor, World Anvil. If you've ever tried your hand at inventing an alien world, you know how difficult it can be to keep track of everything, from species and geography to lore and narrative. The finer details of your living world can be easily lost, and are sometimes hard to visualize. But with World Anvil, world building is a breeze. You can write up detailed accounts for each of your species, and use the built-in auto-linker function to keep track of how they relate to or descend from one another. Or you can start by building a detailed map and then link each of your species' profiles to their geographic location, making it easy to visualize your creation from a planetary view. From a world building, and especially from a story perspective, one of my favorite features is timeline creation, which allows you to easily add important dates and generate visually appealing timelines for your world, or worlds. And once you've forged your fantasy, sci-fi, or spec evo world, all of your entries are completely searchable. Gone are the days of documents and scattered folders. With World Anvil, the only thing holding you back is your own imagination. So if you want to try out World Anvil for yourself, visit worldanvil.com and enter the code ThoughtPotato at checkout for a whopping 40% off any recurring plan, both yearly and monthly. So if you've had an idea for a Spec Evo project and just haven't figured out where to start, check out World Anvil today and get started. And by the way, I'd love to see your finished projects. For now though, we'll be returning to the alternate histories that All Other Tomorrows has in store for us. The original lineage of the Bone Crushers is as fascinating as it is diverse. It began when the Q specifically bred a subset of humanity to act as pets, with large tooth-derived beaks solely for display. Once the Q vanished, most of these pampered pets died out, unable to fend long for themselves, but others managed to thrive, filling both herbivore and predator niches across their home planet. The one thing they all had in common? Large beaks that jutted out from their mouth. The Bone Crushers themselves were just one of these many species, but they achieved what their relatives did not: a primitive form of intelligence. But no matter how far their rudimentary society advanced, they were limited by their own physiology. As scavengers, the Bone Crushers were only able to digest putrefying meat, which severely limited their population. As a side note, as you might have guessed, the Bone Crushers smelled terrible, at least to our perception, and not only because of their diet. To show affection, this species defecated on each other. For them, this was all quite natural. Eventually, the lack of decaying resources led to the Bone Crushers' extinction, at least in the original timeline. In another, they achieved greater success. They learned how to artificially ferment flesh, allowing them to avoid mass starvation. This caused a number of physiological changes as well. Without the need to crush bones and tough flesh, the Bone Crushers' beaks shrunk, and the lack of competition saw their bodies reduced in size. All of these changes led to an entirely new classification. This species was now called the Rot Eaters. Despite all these changes, the Rot Eaters retained their ancestors' heightened sense of smell, which was as deeply a part of their culture as sight is to ours, and their sweat glands as vital to communication as vocal cords are to us. Still, even with all this advancement, the act of affectionate defecation remained ingrained in the Rot Eaters' culture. Depicted here is one of this race's most renowned scientists, a product of the Rot Eaters' success as a species. While many of humanity's descendants, so twisted by the Q, might bear a vague resemblance to their ancestors, some were so hideously changed that their form was entirely unrecognizable. Such was the case for the Temptors, a race that showcases the true extreme of sexual dimorphism. The females, originally bred as plant-like decorations for the Q, were little more than beaked cones of flesh rooted in the soil. The males, on the other hand, were fully mobile, but much, much smaller. Temptor society was simple. Using a combination of pheromones and vocal cues, the females completely controlled the males. With no will of their own, the males were essentially drones, feeding and caring for the female in every aspect. Though bizarre to us, this system was terribly efficient. Unfortunately, in the original timeline, a comet struck the Temptor's home planet and ended their entire species. But now, by peering into an alternate timeline, we can catch a glimpse of how things might have progressed for these ill-fated descendants of humanity. Over time, the males grew even more specialized, splitting into several anatomically differing castes, the affiliation to each determined by their mother's hormonal balances during gestation. As a result, the means of controlling these crowds of workers and soldiers grew more and more intricate, until they were guided almost as directly as radio-controlled toy cars. Competition between the anthill-like colonies of females and their drones grew increasingly fierce, and spurred the development of true intelligence. Eventually, some colonies developed fire and established agriculture. At this point, the Temptors had become something entirely new: the puppeteers. Puppeteer civilization advanced rapidly, but the feudal-like societies were quickly met with the problem of overpopulation. The largest cities might only contain a few thousand land-owning females, but millions and millions of males. To combat this growing issue, two schools of thought emerged. On one side were the progressives, who argued that the majority of males should be replaced with machines. On the other side were the conservatives, who saw the males as extensions of their bodies and considered this innovation a transhumanist perversion. Eventually, the transhumanists prevailed, but only after a war that culminated in the use of a genetic weapon that rendered the enemy queens sterile. In the aftermath, most living males were slaughtered and replaced with machines. It was a cruel result, but one that ultimately saved the puppeteers from extinction, and even allowed them to reach a space age of their own. Pictured here are two males of different castes belonging to a pre-automation enthusiast. Both are heavily modified for their jobs with a combination of genetic engineering and mechanical augmentation, and controlled directly by the queen's brain. The towers seen in the background are the residences of their queen's relatives, each populated by just one female and a few hundred servants, mechanical and organic alike. For a time, the low-gravity world of the Striders was a kind of paradise. These delicate descendants of humanity lived peacefully among forests of towering plant life, completely free from predation. The only real danger for these graceful creatures was their own crippling fragility. If even a gust of wind were to topple them, their thin and stretched bones would likely shatter on impact. Still, as a species, the Striders were successful, that is, until an avian predator emerged, wiping out their entire population. But in this alternate timeline, a random mutation occurred in one of the Strider populations, drastically expanding an ability that had only begun to emerge in the greater species, the ability to change skin color. Now, when the predators arrived, these Striders learned the ability to completely camouflage, blending in with the plants and branches they called home. To further escape the dangers the forest floor presented, the Striders adapted to a fully arboreal lifestyle. Even more adaptations began to emerge as well. Leaf-like outgrowths grew from their limbs, and at-will wrinkling of the skin eerily resembled tree bark. Their bodies lightened by shrinking in size, but also became sturdier in order to survive jumps from tree to tree. Their unique morphology allowed the Striders to visually communicate at long distances by rapidly changing the color and position of the leaf-like growths on their heads and long twig-like fingers. At close distances, they spoke with long, deep, woodwind-like hoots. The need to navigate their complex, three-dimensional environment quickly spurred the re-emergence of intelligence, and soon the now sentient stickmen drove their bird predators out of the forests. Gentle and relatively fragile as they were, the stickmen developed a culture emphasizing calmness, patience, and prudence. Descended from creatures that had to stay motionless for extended periods of time, they disliked conflict and bustle, preferring quiet activities that demanded a great deal of concentration. In both depth and complexity, the philosophies and spiritual teachings the stickmen produced rivaled those of the Terra Sapiens, but were diametrically opposite in their message. Pictured here is a stickman resting in a treetop. He is able to enter a kind of cataleptic state, sitting completely motionless for hours on end. Many of his world's prime vacation spots would seem deeply unsettling to the modern human, being eerily quiet and filled with surreal people standing as still as statues. As we've seen, thanks to the efforts of Vanga VanGog, the alternate histories for at least a few of the Q's twisted experiments are decidedly more hopeful. If you'd like to see more of their artwork, be sure to check out their link in the description. Also, a huge shout out to World Anvil for making this video possible. Once again, check out their link in the description for 40% off a recurring plan. And if you can't get enough speculative biology, be sure to check out this video. Until next time, thanks for watching, and remember, you have intrinsic value, and you matter.